Well, speaking of such fiscal rectitude and what's going on with respect to the legacy system and the IMF, and basically those Bretton Woods organizations that we've come to know and love and hate, since the 1940s. What do you foresee with respect to actions they're taking? Their comments about what's going on with El Salvador. What's next, do you think, for those legacy Bretton Woods organizations? I'll send this to you, Max.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just comment briefly on something that was, just talking about, because it plays into this idea of toxic Bitcoin maximalism. And where does that come from? It comes from the fact that if you've been doing this for almost 12 years, you're starting from a position where literally 100% of the people on planet Earth were against this idea or hated this idea or refused to accept this idea. And it's been a struggle to get people to look at this idea for 12 years. So Bitcoin is very, very different in that respect, because if you come up with something like a better mousetrap, right, the world will beat a path to your door. Innovation creates demand and creates all kinds of momentum economically, and we've seen this in many industries. But with Bitcoin, because you bring innovation to money, actually the first response anyone has is to throw up, because you're taking something that they hold dear to their psyche, in their consciousness, and you're saying that's wrong. Everything you've thought about money is actually wrong. And nobody wants to accept that. Nobody wants to deal with that. So from the very beginning, when you keep telling people you're wrong, the response is, "Well, you're toxic. You're toxic. You're a maximalist." That's what people respond, because they're being told that they're wrong. Over and over again. And so it's hard to be on the side of a Bitcoin, believer, because you're having to. It's like being an exorcist. You show up in the middle of the night and Linda Blair is on the bed, trapped in a fiat money devil, and you're trying to get her to come to Jesus, come to Satoshi, and they're projectile vomiting everywhere. It's a messy business. Um, so I just wanted to say that. As far as El Salvador goes, I had Tour de Meester on my show in 2014, and we were trying to spitball who would be the first country to adopt Bitcoin. We mentioned a few names. We didn't mention El Salvador, but we thought it would be a smaller country, an agile country, a country that needed its own money that was being abused by the dollar system. I also had Trace Mayer on, if anyone remembers Trace Mayer. We talked several times about Bitcoin on the sovereign level. So we've just been waiting for the country to come along and say, "Hey, we're going to make Bitcoin legal tender." And El Salvador was that country, primarily from the work of Jack Mallers and the Strike Lightning Wallet, and El Zonte. It gravitated up to the president's office, and the rest is history. And it's it's the IMF clearly doesn't like this, and we just had a story this past week where Bitcoiners were on the New York Post. They had a story that Bitcoiners are basically psychopaths, and the Bitcoin is basically evil. Again, I return to this is the whole history, as the exorcism that we've lived for 12 years, having to deal with this denial by the vast majority of the population, who do not want to reconsider or consider that everything they have believed about money is false. And yet that's where we're at. Everything everyone believes about money is false. Even the gold bugs, gold bugs, who you would think would be more sympathetic to Bitcoin, most of them are also hate Bitcoin because it challenges everything they believe about gold. So you end up being, if you're a Bitcoin maximalist, you're a hated figure because nobody wants to face the fact that they've been dead wrong their whole lives about something very basic like money. The humans are basically just food and sex, the primary drivers. and behind that is money. And so when you destroy that model, no one's going to pat you on the back and say, thank you for crushing my worldview. Thank you for destroying the paradigms upon which I've based my entire existence. No, they're going to hate you for that. But it doesn't change the fact that Bitcoin's on this unstoppable path, unstoppable vector. And what we say is, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. Just, let it happen. You've been wrong your whole life, but it doesn't mean that you can't start to be right about what's happening.
Well said. Well, you've been taking arrows from all directions, Max, for well over a decade. Likewise, Simon. Playing off of what Max said, is it the same? Do you see the same rejection psychologically? Do you see the same struggle that people have getting their head around this thing? And then also, if you were the guy or one of the very few guys who a decade and a half ago was saying this is going to go in a very different direction, right? The system, is wrong and it's going to change drastically. How have the slings and arrows been for you? And has it ever gotten easier?
Yeah, well, Bitcoin makes it really easy because if you have a longer term time frame, you just like, I've never been more consistently proven right than with Bitcoin. So, Bitcoin punishes the short term thinker and rewards the long term. I'm eternally grateful for Bitcoin because it changed my life financially forever. I never imagined that it could possibly have such a big impact on me, many of the companies that I created, and many of the countries that I've tried to support over the years in adjusting to this new this new paradigm. So I don't really concern myself too much because I have such conviction in the fact that most people come to the conclusion on their own. For example, in 2014, we launched the first Bitcoin bond. We could only find 17 investors to invest in the Bitcoin bond. It turned out to be one of the highest performing investments in history. And those that invested in it, thank us forever. And those that didn't invest in it come back to me and say, Jesus, why didn't I listen? So it's got this self correcting mechanism where you don't get too many people that are just going to wait right until the very end, like the Peter Schiffs of the world, and because he's gone too far in telling his investors not to buy it. But in terms of like the IMF and stuff like that, countries have choices right now, and the choice is that you can either if you were an IMF and you're issuing a loan, you have a choice, and that is that you can take your money, you lend your money. You created it out of thin air because IMF is actually money creation on a global scale as well through special drawing rights, which are overdraft facilities rather than, it's a very misleading term. Because although there is a fund that pulled their gold together in order to be a member, they also are involved in money creation through special drawing rights. And World Bank also is involved in money creation because they issue bonds that are purchased by banks, and banks create digital currency every time they issue a loan. So a bank creates the money in order to purchase the bond. So these are completely illegitimate loans, but they all come. I released a video called Bitcoin Has No Terms and Conditions. And so when you borrow money from the IMF, it is going to come with terms and conditions, because if you were lending your money and it was a highly risky proposition, then you would want to direct politics. You'd want to have influence over the direction of the company. You take the money and you make sure that it's spent back in your country. And then you saddle the country with debt. The dollars end up back in America, through corporate interests. And then when the loan is defaulted upon, you privatize the very resources that are keeping those countries. And, if you look at IMF loans, they've been paid off many times over in the interest that they paid, and they're still deeper in debt, almost 5 times over, even though they have repaid those loans in the interest repayments many times over. And so it hasn't worked well for very many. Same with the infrastructure loans that come from, China empire building. At the moment. And, Sri Lanka is a classic example. You look at Sri Lanka, it's ladled with IMF debt. is defaulting on many of its sovereign debt. It's taken loans from China. And yet it could, look at what El Salvador's doing. It could issue a bond for a very specific project based upon Bitcoin, so that you don't necessarily have to concern yourself too much with just the project. There's also the Bitcoin play, and it has no terms and conditions. So staying sovereign is really the key to, when I look at a lot of the political conflict, a lot of this political conflict is caused, if you look back at Ukraine, it was one of the largest debtors to IMF. That comes with terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions are, we need to build military bases, which then gets you into NATO politics. You build it on Russia's border, and then you have these types of politics that can happen. And it is because it is these international loans that can have a significant path and difference for your country. And so by having Bitcoin as a mechanism whereby countries can make it legal tender for their individuals, provide services to convert it to local currency, gold, Bitcoin, dollars, and then also issue bonds upon it, that's a really exciting proposition. So our industry is just getting started. If you're involved in it right now, you are still an early adopter.